industry belongs to this trajectory of revolts. And if you look at the history of Malayalam cinema, I think it shares something common with the South Indian scene. Directly the capital for Malayalam film industry initially came from the usury capital, the rural usury capital, which found that lending to farmers was not profitable anymore during the Great Depression of the 1930s, late 20s and 1930s. That was invested in the film industry, and it came with an entire feudal baggage by which the Malayalam female film actors were treated as sexually available. And so they all dropped all actors because they wanted to stay above all of this. I mean, that is how traditionally actors are. They are supposed to be outside. So all of them drop caste names, any kind of markers, and they accept screen names. And so, and their bodies seem to be sexually available to everybody who can go to the sea, visually available at least. And so they were also suspected to be, not good women, not moral women, and so on. The stigma persisted for such a long time. Then this began to change in the 1980s, when cinema itself began to be perceived as something more than just consumption and enjoyment. And a lot of these educated young women, by the way, with their caste names, began to enter this field. So you have Manju Warrior and some Nair and some, Revati, I think, was the last of this group to take a screen name, but she would, in every other instance, she would call herself Asha Keluni. So you bring your Janma capital as a kind of protection to this field, hoping that it will protect you against this kind of. Bhavana herself is actually some Menon, I don't know what. So it's interesting how women who come into this field with higher levels of what I call Janma capital, of birth, birth capital, Janma capital. So Janma capital are the ones who began to collide with the alpha male culture, the feudal alpha male culture. So holding on to these caste or family names, Parvati, when she came, she was just Parvati. After a little while, she became Parvati Tiruvota, and Tiruvota is a big known Nair Tarwad in Kerala. So, that's a sign. So, this did not stop the cyberbullying, but it protected them from the abjection that the prostitute suffers, and also it was important for in drawing the sympathy of the public. So, you have all these educated young women, look at them, how the older generation, you can understand they were not educated, and then they were not exactly from good families and all that. So that's kind of what these women, however, should be protected. So this is how the public has responded. So the contrast between the sex workers movement is very interesting, because they too rejected a glorification of the Vaishya past and all that. What they wanted was to turn sex work into a professional kind of work, like a kind of expertise in giving advice to people seeking advice on sex and so on. So it's some kind of an intellectual labor of sorts, bodily, but still, with a strong intellectual component. So they're not trying to go back to some hallowed past of the Vaishya or something like that. But then that movement declined because why? Because it was led by women who practiced sex work, and for that reason were already condemned. And of course, they all came from oppressed castes. They did not have these fancy surnames, nothing. The same can be said for the women of the soft porn cinema, and for nothing did Shakila ally herself with the trans women, saying that the trans women, because the trans women also face this, but they refuse to, condemn sex work. They refuse to be, sit in the chair of the prostitute. They call themselves sex workers. They kind of resisted this process in a much stronger way, perhaps. And so you'll see that, however, that the trans resistance and the sex workers' resistance really is does not get that kind of acceptance. You can also see a similar divide in a new generation of young women who carry out sexualized self-presentation on digital platforms, saying that it's their political resource to against conservative society. So they appear in bikinis, they do all kinds of, and some of them do paid acts also for a small group. But here you have, so Rashmi Nair does it, so also Rahana Fatima. Rahana Fatima is far more political than Rashmi Nair, but Rahana Fatima gets gali after gali. The state treats her as a public nuisance, arrests her, throws her in jail. Rashmi Nair is protected. And that's because Rashmi Nair's Nair surname is the dividing line between her persona and her person, of her as a person, and her persona on the digital media. Rahana does not have that. So I mean, I just want to say that even as we celebrate these gains, there is much to do, because the WCC's victory, and I will say victory because despite all this, the mood of the public has changed. So if you go to restaurants now with film, song of this stupid fellow called Mukesh playing on screen, women look away in disgust. And that's where you can see that all these stars, Mohanlal, Mammootty, all these fellows, their star value has actually plummeted. So I would say that it's a victory of sorts. But I do think that the issues of trans women in the film industry, the issues of, the internal inequalities of women in cinema need to be addressed very strongly. If you look at the Hema Committee report, there are 4 different kinds of violence that it identifies. There is discrimination, there is exploitation, there is sexual violence, and there is retribution. 4 kinds of violence, of which if you look at the testimonies given, the worst sufferers are not really the upper stratum, the upper echelons of the star system. They are the women in the bottom. And these are not often, the privilege holders of surnames. So there is a need to take into account these issues if we want a real resolution of the struggle. Yeah, I'll stop there. Thanks. Thank you.